The difficulty we have, and I understand the import of your question, is the point at which you say that this particular activity, the child abuse that's going on, is endemic to or systemic within that particular organisation. And firstly, how do you establish that? How do you establish that, and what do we mean by endemic in and systematic in? To what extent does it so permeate that particular organisation as to in fact be part of its purpose? And if that is in fact the evidence of the matter, then there's no question in my mind that such an organisation ought not be endorsed as a charity. It's contrary to public policy.
Father Lucas, can I just ask a supplementary to Senator Cameron's line of questioning in relation to that? I take your point that if it's not the teachings or it's not systemic in the organisation in terms of the issue of child abuse, but what happens in circumstances where allegations or evidence of child abuse becomes, the hierarchy of the organisation becomes aware of that and they don't act with it appropriately? They either don't report it to the authorities, which would be an offence in terms of being required to notify that in most states, as I understand it, or they actually cover it up. Whilst that's not one of their purpose, you know, in terms of it's a slightly different question to that put to you by Senator Cameron. Do you think it's reasonable that in those circumstances the organisation should be held to account in the context of the public benefit test?
Well, if we've got the leader of an organisation behaving badly, criminally, that leader ought to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
No, that's not quite what I asked, though.
I know, but that's the answer I'm giving, because that is in fact what needs to happen. The organisation itself need not necessarily have its charitable status put at risk because it has at that particular time a bad leader. If that bad leader who's done whatever wicked thing is alleged the leader has done, it needs to be replaced, it needs to be prosecuted, but that in itself ought not necessarily affect the charitable status of the organisation that he has ineptly led.
Thank you for your answer. Let's go one before you go back to Senator Cameron. If it's a case where it's established that there has been a cover-up in the organisation of child abuse, of allegations of or evidence of child abuse not being reported to the authorities, and a warning is given to that organisation saying, you must do this differently, you cannot hide these allegations any further, if there's been fair warning given and the systems don't change for reporting, ensuring that those responsible are brought to account, would you then say in those circumstances that the issue of the public benefit of that organisation is compromised if they don't change their ways?
Well, Senator, the difficulty in answering your question is knowing who the they is who hasn't changed their ways.
Hypothetical terms.
Well, and I'm answering.
And the they would be if those responsible at a senior level, if there are systemic, that the protocols, the processes of that organisation don't change to ensure that there is mandatory reporting, for instance, and that people are brought to account to the authorities, if a blind eye continues to be turned, would that compromise the whole issue of public benefit?
Of the organisation?
Yes.
Not necessarily, because you've got to then draw the connection between the organisation itself, how big is it, who are the other parties to that organisation, what can other people within the organisation do to remedy the ineptness of a particular group who've acted illegally. So the connection between the inept, illegal, criminal, wicked activity of a leader, if such is the case, and the consequences for the organisation that they have ineptly led, that needs to be drawn, I think, more precisely with respect.
I'll let Senator Cameron continue. Perhaps when I have my chance, I'll follow that up.
Yeah, I'm going to move on, Father Lucas. I'm not trying to, have some public, trial of the Catholic Church on this.
Senator Cameron, if I could perhaps put your mind at rest. I was certainly aware that such a question as you may raise would be a possible question in this, even though this is about a particular bill relating to public benefit. But if Senator, you want more detail of my views on this matter, I gave evidence to the New South Wales Police Royal Commission on this subject, and you can read that evidence and you can read the report of that Royal Commission, which more than adequately covers all of these sorts of issues.
Yeah, thanks. Look, in relation to the Catholic churches generally, the Catholic Church generally in Australia, have you got any idea what the financial benefit for tax-free status is to the church?
No, Senator.
It's a trick question because nobody knows.
No, I think, Senator, perhaps it's a question that's often asked. It's also a question, you know, what is the wealth of the church? And every year or two, Business Review Weekly publishes a league table, and I think Catholic organisations are about the top, 8 of the top 10 or thereabouts. We have 1,699 schools. Every single one of those gives an absolute accounting down to the last dollar to the department for not only the money that comes by way of government grants, but also its private income. The Catholic Church conducts in Australia 75 hospitals. 21 of those are public hospitals. Every single one of those gives an absolute accounting down to the last dollar. It has some hundreds of organisations involved in aged care, in excess of 9,000 aged care beds, and the reporting requirements in the aged care industry
Are these charitable organisations?
Every single one of them. And they are required to give a very detailed accounting. I think we have to look then at tax benefit in a number of different ways. Some of our organisations are public benevolent institutions, and they get certain tax benefits that are different to those that are charitable institutions. Some are deductible gift recipients, and many aren't. And each of those has a different structure in terms of what we might measure as the cost to the public purse. I was present here when Dr. Turner was asked questions about competitive neutrality and the like, and Professor Miles McGregor-Lowndes gave an answer to that. It's a commonly asked question, but it goes back to a much more complex philosophical question as to what exactly in Australia we decide we want to tax. We don't tax the mutual funds. We don't tax a child's pocket money. We don't tax money that's received by way of gift. If you win the lottery, you don't pay tax on that. Because we have a view about what we tax, and we tax income. And with respect, charitable sector as such lacks transparency.
But you're not...
To the revenue of charitable organisations, we've got to firstly decide whether we consider it's in the same category as income, and that's a matter of debate and discussion. The amount's not the point, it's the principle. But where does the money come from? And if it comes from the generosity of the people who are part of the organisation itself, and they've built up the institution through their generosity, that's one aspect that has to be taken into account. But then we have to, and I think this is always the key to the discussion about the tax status of organisations, where does the money go? And I heard Senator Xenophon rightly ask a question in the earlier session. If this particular organisation in fact is simply a front for enriching the people who run it, lavish overseas trips or heavy personal income, notwithstanding they may pay personal income tax on the personal income, then such an organisation is a sham and would not meet the common law test for public benefit as it stands at the moment.
But what about maintaining an unnecessarily high standard of accommodation, such as the merchant banker's retirement home? Why should that be subsidised if it's an unnecessarily high standard?
Well, we're not sure whether the merchant banker's retirement home, what level of subsidy is involved. It might be tax-free, but it may not have any income. Because if it's structured as a cooperative, it may not have any income on which there would be any income tax paid anyway, so its tax-free status is irrelevant. On the question of whether it's eligible for fringe benefits taxed, again, depending on what sort of structure it has, is a different question.
You see, this is the problem. I mean, you're talking about the Commission being problematic. I think it's problematic where we are at the moment, because there is a complete lack of transparency in terms of the expenditure of public money. And if the Productivity Commission, with all the economists employed by the Productivity Commission, can't tell us the cost to the public purse, I think there's a problem. And the way that can be resolved is through a commission.
Well, that's perhaps, Senator, one way, but some of it may be able to be resolved, but can I take issue with respect to the assumption that there is complete lack of transparency? My 1,699 schools give the most detailed accounting,
Of course.
to the government, to the last dollar. Absolute accountability and absolute transparency.
But
We put that through the health sector, the aged care sector. So I think it's not fair to assume that the charitable sector as such lacks
because
transparency.